Hello, and thank you for joining us. We're going to begin the presentation in just a moment. We're just going to give everyone a chance to log in. Thanks. Hello, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Miro Consulting webinar on 5 ways to avoid overpaying for Microsoft Azure products. My name is Sean Donahue, and I'm the VP of Marketing here at Miro Consulting. Joining me today is Miro's Director of Technical Services, Tim Hegedus. If you have any questions during the broadcast, please use the question box in your webinar control panel, and we'll answer them at the end of the session. And please note, your questions are only visible to us, the presenters. We'll read them out, but we won't identify who asks. Before I begin, I would like to briefly explain who Miro is. Miro Consulting is the leading global provider of software asset management and subscription management services for Oracle, Microsoft, IBM, Adobe, and Salesforce. We specialize in license management, audit advisory, negotiation tactics, and support management, as well as cloud services. Our mission is to help our clients maximize ROI on their software license and subscription investments, stay in compliance, and negotiate successful contracts and audit settlements. And with that, I'll begin the presentation. Tim, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Sean, and welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and for those of you in the Northern Hemisphere, welcome to summer. We're on in central New Jersey, where it's very, very, very hot today, and I don't want to detract from our friends down in the Louisiana area who have undergone Barry, and our hearts go out to you. Today, we're going to take a look at Azure. Now, we're going to push forward with that simply because it's a timely topic, considering how many organizations are considering a transition to the cloud, or in fact are maturing their cloud presence. And with Microsoft having started its new fiscal year, many new changes accompany that, right? Not the least of which is cost. So we're going to talk about Azure in a lot of different ways this afternoon. In a recent report from Business Insider, analyst Keith Weiss of Morgan Stanley stated that it is growth in Microsoft's old-fashioned enterprise software that will power the Microsoft earnings. Now, of course, he was speaking about share price, but he did predict that Microsoft would become a trillion-dollar company a year in advance. Now, his prediction was it was Azure that would launch Microsoft into that rarefied air currently populated by only Amazon and Apple. And so we're talking about Azure, and we're talking about how to manage that investment. Now, there's a lot more that goes into this, and some of these points, as well as others, would fit your particular circumstance, or perhaps not so much. But let me start off with money. Many decision makers, swayed by the vendor account teams, will swoon at the cost reduction. That is something of a false hope, because when the cost of transitioning to on-premise to cloud, you must factor in things like network bandwidth, training, consulting, and the migration itself. So the initial costs can be far greater than anticipated. Then the ongoing costs reflected in the subscription fees are, a forever thing, right? I'm kind of fond of saying that they are a forever thing. Sure, these fees do supplant the funding of new hardware and largely the support fees for that new hardware, but on balance, these later costs are more controllable. But there are ways to manage the cost of Azure. But since you are paying for virtually every part of the cloud, the old way of thinking about deployment simply won't work. It requires a new way of thinking, and it requires a new way of going about budgeting for these particular deployments. So let's delay no further in getting to them. Well, when we talk about deallocating VMs, this particular strategy would appear on the surface to be a no-brainer. Yet, literally thousands of virtual machines are left running and abandoned every day. Now, at the great risk of professional peril, let's assume that the image being used for the VM is appropriate. That is, the number of processors, the memory, etc., are all relevant to and pertinent to the VM instance. For those that are unsure, we'll get to reporting a little bit, so just hold on. Okay, so you've decided to deploy to the Azure cloud, and you've matured with respect to the transition from on-premise. But unlike these on-premise deployments, each VM is a chargeable entity. Now, we all know that production issues, reprioritized initiatives, and changes to in-flight projects are just some of the causes requiring not only your technical personnel, but also computing resources. So if a new VM is spun up on-premise and then forgotten, there could be some residual garbage lying around. But typically, there's no associated charges with that. But if this instance were to be spun up in the cloud, well, there would still be the residual garbage lying around, but also charges associated with that VM itself. In other words, the charges accrue for as long as the VM remains running. So by stopping the VM, that is the processor, the memory, and the other aspects of the VM, they are also released, and the customer would not incur a charge. And if and when that VM is to be reused, it can simply be restarted. So perhaps a way to ensure that the abandoned VMs are not lying around, an organization could institute something called Azure Automation. This feature can schedule the starting and stopping of VMs, as well as its associated resources. For VMs that are transitory in nature, that is for a specific purpose or for a specific duration, the auto stop parameter can be set up. Now, there is another feature called Azure Dev Test Labs. This allows for controlled self-service in spinning up of VMs. It uses reusable, customized templates, and it can also cap the quantity of VMs that are permitted for each user. And the service can also automatically start and stop VMs and offers a method to track costs through its lab cost trend capability. So in the end, avoiding VM sprawl is a constant battle. And to lose that battle in the cloud is a very costly loss. So these approaches are sound, and they are easy, and there are ways to combat and control those particular costs. Now, Microsoft offers many storage options under Azure, many of them. And many, quite frankly, are overkill in Miro's experience. For our purposes, we'll just examine two of the most common of the storage options, general purpose accounts versions 1 and 2. Now, on the surface, they would appear similar, but there are really very stark differences. While both support various types of storage, like blobs and files and disks, etc., only version 2 utilizes the latest Azure storage features. Version 1, on the other hand, is designed for more classic deployments. It also does not support the Azure Resource Manager and that deployment model. Now, in the end, or at the beginning, let's say, right, version 1 is less costly than version 2. But Microsoft recommends version 2 for all but the most experienced Azure customers. And of course they do, because it's more expensive. But version 1 does have its uses. Smaller deployments that are heavily transactional are targets for a V1 storage deployment. So, which is correct? Well, understand that there are limitations in version 1 that price alone may not overcome. The incorrect use of version 1 could, in fact, become cost prohibitive. And there are ways to upgrade from version 1 to version 2, but the damage will have already been done. Now let's talk about redundancy. Okay? Certainly not a one-size-fits-all scenario, nor should it be. Azure offers local redundancy, zone redundancy, and geographical redundancy for both full and read-only access. And each one is different in both its capabilities and its pricing. So, for example, development projects probably do not call for geographical redundancy, the most expensive. But neither do some production deployments or production projects or production applications. So careful consideration and categorization of storage requirements becomes essential. Now, when we talk about this, we talk about moving the storage to the cloud, we're talking about the fact that some of these data types might require masking. After all, the storage is cloud resident, and your organization may have some governmental regulations or corporate policies in force that dictate how this data must be treated. And we'll talk about this encryption and other security methodologies in the next slide. But these are some of the ways that Microsoft Cloud Costs can be controlled from a storage perspective. But again, it takes an understanding of the requirements of the application and its data juxtaposed or put alongside against the cost of the solution. Right? This understanding will bring together the total investment as it relates to storage. Now, as promised, we're going to talk about security. And just like the various storage options to be considered, Microsoft makes available an array of security options. So, now, Azure is replete with its own, right? In addition to internal audits and monitoring and logging and penetration tests, access controls, defined network routing, firewalls, and others that are built into Azure, there are a variety of other services that are for fee. For example, for applications, there is vulnerability scanning and layered architecture. For storage, there's what they refer to as RBAC, or role-based account control, as well as encryption both in transit and at rest. For the network, there are security groups and gateways. For the compute layer, there's anti-malware as well as the Azure Security Center. And for identity and access management, there is a multi-factor authentication capability as well as Azure Active Directory services. All enhancements, extensions to the security that's built into Azure. Now, the question is whether these services are necessary for every one of your applications. And the answer is probably not. But to make things easier, an organization may opt for a standard, straightforward, somewhat simplistic approach, a kind of a one-size-fits-all solution, right? Now, I know it's hard to imagine that this categorization would have to be done for every one of your applications. But think of it this way. It only has to be done once, right? And then If it is incorporated into the software development lifecycle, or SDLC, then it becomes just another set of criteria to define. And let's not forget the periodic audits, which might include that or influence that security level. Now, before that process begins, there's two important points to recall, right? One is your applications or the entire organization, which may be subject to government regulations like SOX or HIPAA or GDPR. Those factors must be put into the equation, into the assessment, because the levels of security necessary might have already been prescribed. And to tie that thought into another, recognize that Microsoft, as well as other vendors, are in fact forced, to invest very heavily in their security for no other reason than reputational damage. Right? What I'm saying is that if one of these providers were to get hacked, get breached, lose a lot of data, that could bode very ill not only for themselves, but for the entire industry. And since they are processing other organizations' data, Microsoft and its colleagues must take every precaution necessary. So I want to leave you with this, right? For more detailed information about how Microsoft secures that platform, we're going to suggest that you visit the Microsoft Trust Center. That resource provides the information necessary for you and or your security team to assess the protections available and help determine whether your applications can be ported to the Microsoft Azure cloud. Now, one aspect of transitioning to the cloud, virtually any cloud, is that the service can become intractable. That is, once it has taken on some level of incumbency in your critical business operations, it becomes entrenched. It becomes very difficult to remove. And that is right what Microsoft wants. Right? Now, there's a great deal that goes into the decision about which applications are to be transitioned to the cloud. We spoke of a couple in the last slide, storage and security, but there are more immediate concerns. Among them, network bandwidth. Transitioning to a cloud-based solution essentially means that you are moving a workload from inside the firewall to outside of it. From personal experience, I know that many networks are not architected for that sort of transition. And depending on your network architecture, that might mean a complete overhaul is required, and possibly an increase in bandwidth to ensure everyone's performance needs meet or exceed expectations. It might also possibly mean redundant network nodes where the more critical business operations are supported. So in other words, money. Right? Another example is technical resources. Depending on which solution is chosen, IaaS or infrastructure as a service, which would require some hands-on deployment, maintenance, and troubleshooting, or PaaS or platform as a service, which may require nearly none of that, the need for technical resources remains. For the period of transition, when both on-premise and the cloud-based deployments are running, the understanding and the experience that have been gained by these resources is very key. And then afterwards, these individuals may have the role as relationship managers with the cloud service provider, and that would be in addition to their more familiar, more typical aspect of supporting the environment. Now, I want to pause just a second to clarify something. Large organizations who have invested large sums of money into their infrastructure are very unlikely to become 100% cloud-based. Similarly, those organizations with very sophisticated security requirements cannot or will not trust their applications and data to run outside of their control. I would also like to reflect on a Gartner statement from this past April. They indicated that, quote, more than 30% of technology providers' new software investments will shift from cloud first to cloud only. Unquote. So this effectively challenges IT departments and their leadership to look to cloud when pursuing the right solution. Now, perhaps these prior two observations are in conflict, right? And so where do we go from here? Well, it's important to recognize, A, that subscription costs can and will rise, and B, these increases could be very unpredictable, which is the very scourge of financial professionals. Now, in the early going, you are faced with potentially paying for something you cannot use or for which you are unprepared. Organizations such as Microsoft do offer free evaluations, right? But it's important to make this evaluation process very, very visible and a prioritized initiative so that when the evaluation period ends, there is sufficient data to render an informed decision. Then there is the ramp-up period, right? This is the period in which the environment exists in both the on-premise and in Azure. And again, Microsoft has this covered. It allows up to 31 days, one time, right, for Windows Server Standard, right, and for allowing allocations to occur both on-premise and in Azure for Windows Server Data Center. So this later benefit is referred to as the hybrid use benefit. Now, to be eligible for it, software assurance has to be active, and that's a whole different topic that we won't get into. But finally, there is the post-transition period, or what we refer to as normal operations. Prepaying for a prescribed period of time is less costly than the pay-as-you-go subscription model. However, prepaying kind of requires some insight into the application itself. For example, is usage cyclical? Is it random? Or is it more static? So all of these options, and these are just a few, lend some predictability to your Azure costs, and your finance team will absolutely love you if you pull it off. But then comes the renewals, and more unpredictability prevails, right? What are the costs associated with Azure deployments at the time of renewal? What are the rates for your usage? How have your applications matured, etc., right? So doubtlessly you will want to protect yourself, protect your organization, so it pays to plan ahead and budget more importantly, or more appropriately, I should say. The last area that we want to talk about today is reporting. And with all that we have said, the best policies and practices in the world are functionally worthless without proper oversight and enforcement. And the simplest, most effective way of doing that is via regular reporting, right? Now, daily reporting is overkill, we think, right? First, things don't change all that frequently, right? Making any daily deviation relatively unnoticeable. Second, we believe that a daily check would kind of inure the person that's monitoring these very slight alterations, and it won't be as noticeable. But let's go back to the first thought. The reporting ought to be sophisticated enough to avoid anything approaching a regular schedule. For example, in the retail vertical, something with which we're all familiar, a consumer-targeted database might ramp up activity during the holiday period. So a more frequent check of performance, and we're thinking of processors and memory here, but also storage and network traffic and other factors would be appropriate on a more frequent basis, as I'm saying. The results of these checks would help to identify both overallocation, right, uh, which is very insidious, as well as underallocation. Now, coupling this idea with communication to the financial team, the sizing, storage, and database services, for example, it would provide an early warning for the stakeholders and kind of allow proactive measures to be implemented. Now, there are tools available to help you monitor your Azure deployments. Obviously, Microsoft offers its own set of APIs and reporting tools for things like Active Directory and SQL Server. And there are others from other software vendors. It's all a matter of taste and management and integration and funding, right? The cost. Some tools fit better than others and work better in certain situations or certain environments. But growing the Azure environment may require some additional considerations, right? So often the tools that you have need to be replaced because they're not capable of handling your environment any longer or the specifics of your environment. So we come to takeaways, and I've talked a great deal, and I'm afraid there might not be time to answer all your questions, but I wanted to leave you with this, right? To repeat, since you are paying for virtually every part of the cloud and virtually every part of your deployments, the old way of thinking about them simply won't work. It requires new thinking, a new thought process. It requires more deliberate understanding of what is required, yet it must be practical. We talk about best practices, and we say we must use these best practices and involve them in managing your Azure environment. Now, we've spoken to some of the more common, certainly the more straightforward ways of doing that, but these practices should be in place at the same time that the transition to the cloud begins, or more immediately, right now, today, for more mature environments if you don't have those processes in place yet. And then finally, when considering your transition to Azure, involve some knowledgeable independent experts from both a licensing perspective as well as from a managed service perspective, because these experts can help you work through the process. They're used to the process, and they can accelerate it and simplify it. So in the end, transitioning to the cloud, and our focus is on Azure here, but virtually any transition is kind of fraught with unknowns simply because your environment is unique. But it doesn't have to be wastefully expensive. So we encourage you, move slowly, move deliberately, understand your objectives, and if necessary, enlist the services of experts. All right. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Sean and see if there are any questions that came in.
Thanks, Tim. We had a couple questions come in, but we're short on time, so we're going to get back to everyone who asked the questions individually after the session. The one thing I want to bring up just on Tim's reporting thing is, take a look at your cloud architecture, whichever vendor you might be using, and a lot of times you'll find that there is alarm reports, and they don't just apply to things that, the server is down kind of a thing. A lot of times you'll find options for alarms that will go off if your billing hits a certain threshold or a certain piece of your billing is higher than it should be in setting. And that's a great way to catch these runaway processes where somebody maybe turned something on and fat fingered it and made it 100 times bigger than it was supposed to be. So that's something, that can really help you out and save on cost. And just again, to reiterate, the best option is don't try to replicate your existing environment. Don't try to build it from scratch. Talk to a licensing expert who can help you use the licenses you already own and plan a migration or plan a partial migration that makes sense for your business needs, and don't fall into the trap of trying to make a mirror image of your on-premise service in the cloud. And those are the final 2 points I wanted to give. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Tim, for this great presentation. Again, if you asked any of the questions, we're going to get back to you right after this session. And if you have any questions you haven't asked yet and would like to, please email us at sales@miroconsulting.com. Call us at 732-738-8511, extension 1208, or visit us on the web at miroconsulting.com. Again, thank you for joining us. Have a great day.